I am really excited and just a little bit nervous because um, originally it was my plan um, to share with you um, to talk about Dr. King's principles of nonviolent direct action. And as I began to look deeply at it and reflect on the organizing I did in Ferguson, um, I began to play with them and shift them a little bit. And so what you're going to get is brand new. Um, it is it's a remix, if you will, of King's Principles of Nonviolent Direct Action. So I would love your feedback. If things that occur to you, if you would just share them in the chat as they emerge, it would be amazing. My name is Nelson Pierce. I am the pastor of Beloved Community Church. I work at Xavier University, and in 2014, I organized in Ferguson immediately after the death of Michael Brown. The and so what you are about to see is my first effort of sharing my my reflections on that organizing experience in Ferguson, on taking the work of Dr. King and merging it in really intentional ways with the work of Adrienne Marie Brown, who wrote a book called Emergent Strategy. And so this work is the combination of all of those things working together. And so let me share this. And so we're going to start with the principles, and then we will move from the principles to the steps. So the first principle is that emergent nonviolence is an active discipline that requires courage and creativity. When people talk about nonviolence, far too often they talk about it as if it is a passive action, as if it's a passive activity. But King's principles of nonviolence were not designed to be passive, but very much active. In fact, King often referred to it as militarized nonviolent resistance, that they would take this nonviolent resistance and put it in action strategically to try to create or surface moral tensions that existed in the structure. And so the same thing I would argue with emergent nonviolence is that it, not just in terms of our movement work, but also in terms of our internal work, that it is an active discipline that we have to live out all of the time. That if we do not have the practice of using courage and creativity in our own lives to interrupt the dominant narratives that we see every day, to question whether or not what we are being told is true, to resist the systems of oppression that are easy for all of us to fall into, that if we aren't doing that work on a regular basis, then we are ill prepared to do the work of active resistance when it comes to movement time. So this is an active discipline that requires courage and creativity. The second thing is that emergent nonviolence seeks to practice the world of justice that it hopes to create. And so King believed that the end result of nonviolence is redemption and reconciliation, and that the purpose is the creation of the beloved community, which can't be created by policy shifts. It has to be lived out daily. that we have to practice the world of justice that we hope to create. Adrienne Marie Brown talks about this in her book Emergent Strategies as when she talks about fractals. She says that all of the universe has a pattern, and that we see similar patterns on things as small as a flower. And those same patterns emerge in things as broad and as wide as the way that stars are aligned in the galaxy. And so she believes the same thing is true for movement work, that the injustice and oppression that we see play out on global scales or on national scales or on state and local scales also plays out in our movement work. And that in order to create a more just system, we have to begin with practicing more just systems in our daily and regular work. And so it is, to me, it is no surprise that the civil rights movement in the 60s was that there were so many things happening because Martin Luther King gets a lot of the credit for that work. But in addition to the work that King was doing with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, there was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. There was a group called CORE. There were several groups that were emerging. The Black Panther Party emerges late in the civil rights movement. There are groups that are emerging. They have tension with each other. They're trying to push and challenge one another. And all of these groups are active in this and trying to teach democratic practices, the practices of democracy, to their members so that they can all take a hold of this democracy and begin to work it and shape it. So the same thing has to be true, that in our lives, in our families, in our networks, in our movements, that each of these we have to practice the justice that we want to emerge worldwide. And so that if we aren't practicing it on the local level, then we can't hope that it will emerge on a global level. I will tell you, I will give you a confession that I spent a lot of time in my 20s and 30s trying to think about how do I change the world? How do I begin or create or become a part of a big global movement? And what I've realized is that global movements emerge. Nobody creates them. Nobody plans them. There is no room where people are creating strategy for global movement. They emerge at a moment's notice. What we are seeing right now is that after the video of George Floyd's murder was shared around the world, and after Minnesota began to protest because of that, protest movements jumped up everywhere. They happened in Columbus and in Atlanta and in Los Angeles and in North Carolina, here in Cincinnati, up in Cleveland. Then they started happening in Canada, in Toronto and Montreal, in Brazil, in France, in Germany, in New Zealand, that these anti-police movements are emerging everywhere. And it is now a global movement. Nobody could have strategized something like that. It just emerges. And so how beloved community emerges worldwide is that we are in the habit of practicing it on a local level, on our organizational level, that we practice it every day. And as we practice it, then it begins to emerge in larger and larger spaces. The third principle is that emergent nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice and not people. And this is one that I have to remind myself regularly because I am a competitor and I want to win. And which means that I want the people that I am going up against to lose. And so what I have to often remind myself is that it is not about the defeat of any person, but it is about the defeat of injustice. Because none of us are right all of the time. There are times that we all are wrestling with how we contribute to or support injustice. And very few people are wrong all of the time. And so when we focus on the person, then it blinds us to the challenges of confronting the issue of injustice. And so to give you a real world example of this, this is the challenge that has emerged with Joe Biden's presidency, and particularly with the Me Too movement, because allegations emerged that Joe Biden sexually abused or somehow was physically inappropriate with someone who worked for him, and people who had been very intentional about taking down other people found themselves at a little bit of a loss for words, because they didn't want to take down Joe Biden because they felt like the stakes were too high, or they weren't sure if they believed that he did it. And there was a lot of lack of clarity about how to handle such a very, very important situation. When we focus on the injustice of the act, it gives us clarity to be able to hold our friends and our opponents to the same level of accountability. And so it's important that that emergent nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice and not people. The fourth principle is that emergent nonviolence requires ongoing healing. Anyone who has been impacted by injustice and oppression, and I would argue that everybody is impacted to some degree by injustice and oppression, that leaves scars and it leaves wounds. And it is so easy, it's natural for us to take those scars and wounds into movement work. And if we aren't doing the work of healing ourselves, then we play out our injuries within the movement work. Those wounds, those injuries also make it very hard to trust people. And movements, Adrienne Maree Brown says that movements move at the speed of trust. And three of her principles involve trust, because she believes, and I think she's right about this, that if we do not have deep and abiding trust, if we are not in trusting relationships with one another, then movements break down, particularly when stress is applied to them. And the closer any movement gets to creating actual change, the more stress is applied to it. And so people have to be in deep relationship in order to be able to navigate the stress. One of my favorite anecdotes from the civil rights movement was in 1964, when the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party had done a marvelous job of organizing and registering people to vote. And they went to the Democratic National Convention. And they came with a demand that the state Democratic Party of Mississippi be barred from the National Convention, and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party be recognized as the official party from Mississippi, because the state Democratic Party was segregated and would not allow Blacks to vote. And so they said, we are the only Democratic Party in Mississippi that allows everyone to participate. And so the Democratic Party should not admit segregated parties, and they should allow the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to represent the state of Mississippi. And Fannie Lou Hamer gives this impassioned testimony about being arrested and being beaten by police officers in jail for trying to register people to vote. The president, President Lyndon Johnson, is so scared of the nation hearing Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony that he has his aides help him throw together an impromptu press conference that takes away the cameras from Fannie Lou Hamer and then broadcasts this press conference that he creates on a moment's notice just so that the nation won't hear this testimony. Then he goes and he meets with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and invites Dr. King to the meeting and says, this is what we'll do. We can't admit you as the state party. We can't disqualify the state party. But what we do is we will admit you as an ad hoc party with 2 votes. We will give you 2 seats in it. And so many people were saying, that's a big win. Even Dr. King was saying, this is an amazing win. You should take this and declare victory and move forward. And then the people in the party had to have a conversation with each other. Do we take the 2 votes? Do we take the 2 chairs? Do we get some kind of recognition? Or do we reject it because it is less than what we asked for? I don't know what happened in that room, but my guess is that emotions got high because there was a lot at stake in this decision. And so you have to have trust to be able to navigate those decisions and come out on the other side as a unified body. And for those of you who don't know the story and want to know how it ends, they reject the offer. They refuse to take the 2 seats. They get people who are sympathetic with their cause and other parties to give their passes to them so they can go on the floor. And then they have a stand-up protest in the middle of the convention and force security to drag them out in order to before they can continue. Principle 5, emergent nonviolence requires radical love. And King notes this by saying that violence is not just about what happens to us, but violence is also what happens inside of us. That often we internalize violence and we begin to do mental, emotional, and spiritual violence to ourselves. Or we project mental, emotional, and spiritual violence to others. And so King says, in order to interrupt that, you have to have a radical love that begins with a radical love of self, that extends to radical love of community, and that works to extend beyond that to radical love of humanity. That to create a beloved community, we have to believe it's possible for people to live together in justice and in harmony. And so that requires radical love. And then principle 6 is that nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice. And that really speaks to hope. It speaks to our hope that we are not in this work alone, but that even when it seems like what we are up against is heavier or bigger than what we can handle, that we believe that there is something that is always at work and is emerging under the surface that will help propel us to what is next. I can tell you, a month ago, there was nobody who anticipated we would be in this place. But all of a sudden things emerge, and now we have an opportunity to move the needle towards justice. Now we have people calling for radical policies that once seemed to be unimaginable, but now they're being called for publicly. And so it believes that the universe, that we do all that we can, and then the universe gives us an assist. And so then there's steps that emergent nonviolence is not just about a set of beliefs or a set of principles, but is also about a set of steps. And so the first step is information gathering. That to understand and articulate an issue or problem or injustice, you must do research and investigate and gather vital information from all sides of the argument or an issue so as to increase your understanding of the problem. You must become an expert on your opponent's position. This is why coalition work is so important. Because none of us have the time to read all of the things that we need to read in order to be an expert on the issues that we are facing. And so we need to have people who are willing to do the work of being on the front lines. We need to have people who are willing to do the deep work of analysis, of policy analysis. We need to do people who are willing to do the hard work of opposition research. And we all must be in community working together so that we can be well informed. Our ability to be effective in our work in large part depends on our ability to do the background, the research, to do the work, or to listen to those who are doing the work so that our efforts can be informed efforts. Education. It is essential to inform others, including your opposition, about your issue. This minimizes misunderstandings and gains you support. And so once we have learned it, it is about us teaching. So when we were in Ferguson, we listened to, we brought in former prosecutors who were working with us, who told us about what the prosecutor system looked like. And that was the information gathering work. And so we bring in all of these experts to help us. And then we have to do the work of education. There were people who came into Ferguson on a continual basis. People were flying in almost weekly to help be a part of it. And so they set up movement schools, movement classes during the day to teach people what was happening, to help people understand how this was not just an issue about Mike Brown, but it was an issue about larger policing in St. Louis County. They did education classes during the day, and then they went out to protest at night. And so by doing that, you are informing, you are sharing the information and informing people so that they can be most effective in your work. It is really hard to try to control everything that is said in movements. They are spontaneous, they emerge, leaders pop up everywhere. And so the education, sharing what you know with others is a critical component of that. Personal commitment. Daily check and affirm your faith in the philosophy and methods of nonviolence. Eliminate hidden motives and prepare yourself to accept suffering if necessary in your work for justice. And so this emerges directly out of King's nonviolence. And that is that we have to do the work internally. Before every action, before they gathered people to go out and march, they always took time to center themselves and do an examination of their own minds and spirits, to ask themselves, were they committed to the principles? Were they committed to the methods? to examine if there were hidden motives that were creeping up inside of them, so that they could work to move past them. What we've seen in these last couple of days in Cincinnati is that people know that there is a curfew, and they've been going out and marching and seeking to protest even in the middle of a curfew, knowing that they would be arrested. And then after hearing the horrific conditions that people were in, people knew, again, they knew that they were subject to this, and people who are willing to do it have gone out knowing what they were getting ready for. And so that work of personal commitment is important, that we understand that we are clear about what we are getting into, that we are clear about the choices we are being asked to make, and that we are ready to engage in that work. The discussion and negotiation. Confront the other party with a list of injustices and plan for addressing and resolving these injustices. Listen closely for where your opponent agrees and disagrees with you. Where you can, build on where you agree. This is where you must remember that your aim is not to defeat your opponent. Your aim is to win. And so we had times in Ferguson where we were so entrenched in the going back and forth, and we had other leaders who stepped forward and say, "Look, we need to at least create the platform to have a conversation." And so we did. We talked to the head of the combined police force and said, "These are the things. These are our grievances. These are the things that we need. These are how things must change." And those conversations did not always go well. But every time the chief of that unit agreed with us on something, we lifted that up in the media and said, "The chief agrees that this is a problem. This is a challenge, that this should not happen." And so we used that to help build leverage and momentum towards the work. And so that requires both the ability to articulate our side, but also listen to what is being said. And negotiation is always, it can be seen as a negative word in movement building, because negotiation seems like settling for something less or selling out a broader movement. But negotiation, in a long-term movement, negotiation is about how do we advance our goal step by step towards our larger aim. So it doesn't say that we stop working. I don't think negotiation should ever include the stopping of the work. But it is, what is it that we can agree on now that prepares us for the next thing that we are working towards? Direct action. There are actions taken. These are actions taken when the opponent is unwilling to enter to or remain in discussion or negotiation. Anytime that the discussion breaks down, we move to direct action. These actions impose a creative tension into the conflict, supplying moral pressure on your opponent to work with you in resolving the injustice. The marches are a form of direct action. It is about applying pressure. It is a way of saying to those who are elected that there are large numbers of people who are not in support of what's happening. And so people are demanding, change. When a direct action shuts down a highway or shuts down a business district, that action is calling the people who are inconvenienced by that into thinking about what is the greater issue. And It is a way of challenging people to break out of the habits that allow us to go about our daily lives and routine and act as if injustice doesn't happen, or to say, you know, that's a shame, and then to keep moving, and to break out of that as a way of hoping that we can imagine ways of being able to live and work together. And so one of the things that we are seeing in this time of COVID-19 is that the ways that we've lived and worked and that we've thought were unchangeable really aren't. And that we've had to move and we've had to recreate new ways of living and working and being in community together. And so all of the direct actions that cause us to interrupt our way of being is a way of doing the very same thing. It is a way of inviting people to break out of their regular habits and to pay attention to injustice that is happening in the moment. And then reconciliation. And so this is one of the places where I move far away from King's language, that the King Center's language around reconciliation talks about friendship. But I really believe that reconciliation is not about friendship, but it is about radical accountability. The work that happened in South Africa at the end of apartheid, where Nelson Mandela and de Klerk and Bishop Desmond Tutu are trying to figure out how do they move a post-apartheid South Africa out of their entrenched systems of oppression and move them towards imagining what a new South Africa might look like. And so they set up these truth and reconciliation conferences in which the people who had done all of these atrocious acts, who had participated in apartheid, people who had kidnapped people and killed people, who had done violence to people, had to come forward and confess in front very publicly about what they had done. Many people, their own families, did not know how they had participated or what they had done. And they had to do that in front of the victims or the families of the victims. They had to tell the truth about what happened and their part in it. And in doing so, they were really placing themselves in a very vulnerable position where the power that they once had to direct and influence and disrupt the lives of others, they had to surrender that power. And not just say, well, let's move forward and forget what happened, but to really come to this point of confession. And so that reconciliation can only happen when this reversal of power happens, where people who have had the power to abuse submit to the judgment of those that they have abused. And so that the end goal is to create this space where this reversal of power happens, but doing so in a way that again tries to tear down the evil systems, so that then it is not about revenge, but it's about accountability. And then once there is accountability, then we can think about how we can move forward. And then so each act of reconciliation moves us one step closer to this larger system of beloved community. Um, so that is the principles of what I call emergent nonviolence. Again, it is me kind of remixing King's nonviolence with Adrienne Marie Brown's work in emergent strategies. Are there any questions, any things that you would like to lift up? If you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm looking. Um, in the chat. Somebody mentioned about Bell Hooks' book, All About Love, in the conversation about radical love. Bell Hooks is a tremendous author who writes deeply about this. And yeah, I agree. Her writing about love is really helpful in thinking about this. The first and second principles are, principle one is that emergent nonviolence is an active discipline that requires courage and creativity. And principle two is that emergent nonviolence seeks to practice the world of justice that it hopes to create. What would I do differently, if anything, from Ferguson to now? It's hard to think about that because each movement is so different and so unique. And it builds, it not just builds on the history of movement, but it builds on the particular context of what's happening in a place, in a location. And so, you know, I think one of the things that we learned very quickly in Ferguson was to do deep listening to what was happening on the ground, and then to be in deep relationship with people and let those relationships form the work. Um, we were able to get, particularly clergy, and that was my primary work, was organizing clergy. We were able to get clergy to have young people who are on the front lines of the movement with them in meetings, and particularly in meetings with state officials, where government officials would want to come in and try to win clergy to their side, and say things that that they believed clergy wanted to hear. And those conversations happen differently when you have someone who's on the front lines of the protest in the room. And it's hard to say, you know, these things aren't happening when people who have experienced it happening. You know, in a very similar way, the Hamilton County Sheriff and the mayor have tried to say that, you know, they're not, that the abuses that have been noted about people who've been arrested haven't happened, except for we have talked with people who have experienced it. We have video evidence of it happening. And so when it's easy to say those things in a room when nobody who has experience is confronting. But when you have that level of, when you bring people into the room with you, then the stories have to play out differently. And that is, again, part of the trust building that happens, is to say that I trust you enough to bring you into this conversation and to elevate your voice. What would you say that trust in each other looks like when they're infiltrators and undercover police? It's really difficult. I look to Malcolm X to that, because Malcolm X always knew that there were people who were trying to infiltrate his work and his movement, both when he was with the nation and when he split from the nation, and was trying to create his own movement work based on his renewed understanding of Islam. He always knew that there were people very close to him that were plants. And he did very little about trying to shield himself from them. He really believed that that if he walked his path with clarity and conviction, that the people walking close to him could not help but be impacted and changed by that. And that worked in some cases. There are people who notably changed and came to him and said that they were there, that they had been planted there, but they had had a conversion because of the time. And also he was killed by people who were at least close enough to be in the room. And so that it's a very difficult balance. And I think we work on it day by day, step by step. That's why we say it's why the first principle is that it's an active discipline. And so every day we work on our ability to trusting ourselves first and foremost, and then beginning to learn how to trust the people around us. And also part of that trust is holding the people around us accountable when their actions break the trust. Right? It's not a blind trust that says, I trust you no matter how you show up, but it is about your ability to be in community, in relationship with me and with the group, and that we build that trust together. Have I led this conversation with young children? How would I advise broaching it? I have not. I think the first thing I would think about is, how are you teaching young children to do this work in their own minds and hearts, right? How do you help them to slow down and pay attention to what's happening? How do you get them to learn how to articulate what is happening inside of them? And then how do you get them to trust and to radically love and accept themselves? And then that lays the foundation for the ability to do it with others. Beyond that, I would want to be in conversation with someone who does serious work around childhood development, to think about what does it look like? What are the age appropriate steps to introduce these concepts with children? What happens if the perpetrators won't submit themselves to judge and try to escape accountability? I would, to me, that is where, that means that they have placed themselves outside of the boundary of the community. That the goal of the community is to create space where people can be engaged in relationship with each other. We know that those relationships will fracture at points. We have pathways to build reconciliation. And when people refuse to be accountable for it, then their actions place them outside of the community. And we have to, if we cannot hold them accountable within the space, then we have to remove them out of the space, not as punishment, but for the safety and protection of the space. And so that would be my answer to that. Would you still argue for only fighting issues, not fighting people, if certain people with political power constantly work against your fight and harm people in your movement? So I think this is also connected to that last question about love and accountability, right? So I don't think that we need to fight people. I think we need to help people to be the best version of themselves. And sometimes the best version of yourselves means that you have no power. And so if we can't convince you to use your power responsibly, lovingly, in the service of community, then we need to take your power away from you. Either uh, either directly through elections, in voting people out of office, because that is the best thing for them, is to have that power removed for them, or indirectly by declaring their authority not valid, which is what protesters do when they go out and march when there's a curfew. They say that this curfew, the authority of granting this curfew is not valid. It does not trump the First Amendment. And so we have a right to peaceably assemble, and we will engage that right, even though the mayor or somebody else has implemented a curfew. And so that's a part of that. But we remember that it is still about the issues of justice, and the people who are dead set against justice. We have to move to get them out of the way. It's the same thing with business owners, right? When we find business owners who are deeply connected to unjust practices, what do? We boycott the business owners, because if you are going to be engaged in using money towards practices, then we need to separate you from your ability to continue to make money. But it's not about the person or the personality. It is about the issue of justice that we hold up and lift up.